And you should be able, I think now, to see a bunch of books. Is that right? Michael nodding your head, yes. All right, fair enough. So actually, although Motown is one of the books that I've done, my wife, who was born in London, also an author, and we've done 15 books over time, starting with a book on Joseph Mengele years ago. I am an attorney. As Michael said, I'm everybody's favorite type of attorney, a non-practicing one. I only am involved in writing now. I've done books on the heroin business and the Chinese Mafia, and books on political assassinations, both Martin Luther King and John Kennedy. A book on Ross Perot when he was running for president back in the 90s. There's Motown right in the middle as sort of the book there, and I've done books on 9/11. Trisha's done, her last book was The Pharmacist of Auschwitz. My last book was put out right at the start of the pandemic in March of 2020. It's a book about the international drug industry, the history of it, a 200-year history. My book before that was called God's Bankers and was a 200-year history of the finances of the Vatican. So we like taking on what I call complex stories. Not all of them are as much fun as Motown. Motown actually came out in 2000 as a hardcover. You'll see it there on the left. And then sometimes publishers put out a version that's a little bit different. They put out the cover that you see on the right as the paperback edition 2 years later. The reviews for Motown were great. What I'm going to try to give you today is what the top line says. That's from Janet Maslin in the New York Times. She says, Posner presents the best and worst of this story with suitable glitter. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of that glitter today and an overview of this rather remarkable label. Where did Trisha and I get all of our information on Motown that was different than everybody else when we were doing this history? In that building right there. Many of you, some of you might who have been to Detroit might recognize it. It happens to be where they kept the court files for Wayne County in downstairs in the archives. It was a time capsule from the 1960s, literally stacks of cardboard boxes, rows of metal file cabinets, wires dangling from the ceiling, and in there were thousands of pages of court files. Every good Motown relationship between artist and Berry Gordy and those who ran the company unfortunately ended up often in a lawsuit. And the court records hadn't been looked at in years, and they were an eye-opener as to what was happening behind the scenes. They really gave us a view that was unique at the time. And here's the person behind it, Berry Gordy. There's nobody quite like him. Without Gordy, there'd be no Motown. Berry Gordy's the seventh of 8 children. His father was the son of a freed Georgian slave and had moved to Detroit for assembly line work 7 years before Berry was born. Some of you might be familiar with him. Some of you might be surprised that in American cities, Detroit in the 1920s was booming. It had a 1,200% increase in population. It was the second fastest growing city in America. The auto business was driving it. So his parents went there for work. They were strict disciplinarians. And Berry actually became an amateur boxer. He was 5'6", weighed 125 pounds. And then in 1950, made a very wise decision when he was 20 years old. He decided boxing was too tough, and he opted for music and songwriting. And that was to be his future. And he ran across a guy who was 17 years old, an unmistakable falsetto voice, and a group called the Matadors. And Gordy introduced himself, and he met a man called Smokey Robinson. And he said, I can release your song. And he did that. So Gordy released an independent song that was pressed on vinyl. It was released on Smokey's 18th birthday called Got a Job with the Miracles at that time. And it was the first hit, started to climb some of the R&B charts. But a small hit, but still there, as something that Gordy was able to do. And this is a time when Gordy forms a company, calls it Hitsville. You'll see him up there holding one of the first records. They first called it Tamla after Debbie Reynolds' hit song Tammy, but they quickly decided not to stay with that, and so they were smart to call it Hitsville. Then they called it Motown, and there were some great lessons for him. He distributed through a large company out of Chicago called Chess. In the 2 cities in which he dealt with independent distributors directly, indies as they called, Gordy made more money with his early albums than he made through the rest of the country, so it convinced him that he had to do it all alone. He wanted to make Motown a vertically integrated company, and he had a couple of people along the way that he met. Barrett Strong was the one who came in with Money. That's Gordy's first hit on Motown. He met a young woman who stopped him when he was leaving a club in Detroit and sang for him a cappella right on the scene, Mary Wells. She had a song. Please, Mr. Gordy, she said, let me talk to you, when he came out of this club called the 20 Grand. He signed her and he released her as well, one of the first stars on Motown. And when he starts Hitsville, it's literally out of a house in West Grand Boulevard in downtown Detroit, formed in 1960. You have to remember, the record business at that time in America and in most countries, even in Europe, was pretty segregated. There were some small independents focusing just on black sort of record companies focusing on black artists. They were like Chess Records out of Chicago. But the big black singers of the day, Aretha Franklin, Nat King Cole, they were released on white-owned mega companies like RCA and Decca. They played on black radio almost only. Black artists ended up on the R&B charts. But Gordy wanted something different. He wanted to cross over black singers to white radio. It was unheard of. So he wanted them to come up with pop sounds that were easy and catchable songs sold to a white market. And the white market of record buyers was much bigger, and Gordy understood that. He said when he had a hit, he wanted 70% of the listeners and 70% of the buyers to be white. Now, that was no easy task. So he has a songwriting team that he comes across that turns out to be instrumental. They really are three of the most talented songwriters ever. Lamont Dozier and the brothers Eddie and Brian Holland. They're wannabe singers who became the powerhouse songwriting team. And he created, with them, an in-house band called the Funk Brothers. They played his acts like Smokey and the Miracles at local clubs, and they started to write the songs that would become the Motown hits. Gordy had an idea for a production line, 3 minutes or less. That's what the songs were to be. He didn't want long songs. He wanted catchy choruses, no politics. They had to sound more like pop than R&B. And how would he get these songs played on white radio stations and sold to stores and through distributors that were basically selling to white artists to white listeners? He hired a group of record distributors who were among the best in the business. A fellow on the left that you'll see sitting there at the bottom, he sort of has the goatee. He's also standing on the right. He has a tuxedo on. That's Barney Ailes. He had worked for Capitol Records before he joined Motown at the age of 27. He's meeting here with distributors for Motown in New York and Washington. His job was to get the records played on the radio and to ensure not that they were distributed efficiently, but also the invoices got paid. Because if somebody had stiffed Motown and they didn't get the money, Gordy was out of business. As important as the quality of the music was, this was the secret to Gordy's operation. Business had to be taken care of with a different attitude than the other black-owned labels. He wanted someone who could talk to white disc jockeys and record distributors without the barrier or the unconsciousness of race. And so literally you were able to see it take place. And there's this great moment in Motown's past when he's hired Ailes, and Gordy and Ailes go to a restaurant in Detroit that's this upscale restaurant, and they're told at the door, "We don't serve colored people." And Gordy says, without missing a beat, "Well, great, I don't eat them." And Ailes broke out in hysterics, and the two of them were able to get in the restaurant. The first crossover hit they had was Shop Around. And that's a hit by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. It's played on American Bandstand. It's #1 on the R&B charts and #2 on the pop charts. Gordy hated that he wasn't #1 on the pop charts. You'll see the woman sitting there to the right with Smokey pointing at something. That is Esther Gordy. That's one of Barry's sisters. He made it a family operation. She runs a part of the business called International Talent Management. And Gwen Gordy, another sister, worked with her. Motown did it all. Remember, they are in Detroit. They aren't in Los Angeles or New York. The kids who are coming in to sign with them and become part of the label are not coming in with agents and lawyers. And so when they come in, Motown is representing them through their own talent management. They represent them as agents. They represent them as lawyers. They act as their unofficial bank. They paid them royalties. They did the contracts. They even paid their tax forms in many cases. They set up 2-hour classes with a local Detroit sort of icon, Maxine Powell, to teach the young kids who were coming in sometimes literally out of the projects but had great talent in singing. Table manners, how to shake hands, walking by balancing books on their head. Showed the girls how to sit with pencil-thin skirts like ladies when they were on a television show like the American Bandstand. Miss Manners, they called her. Gordy was always thinking ahead to the time when they would have to go on the road. One of the kids he signs at this time is blind from birth. He's the singer Stevie Wonder. Here he is in 1963 at the age of 13. He played drums, piano, harmonica. Gordy found him when he was 10 years old. Gordy's company made him they were the attorney for Stevie. They were his guardian, and Stevie was paid $2.50 a week despite earning thousands a week in royalties. So one of the first real big signs that Gordy had, but he didn't break through for a few years. These four girls right here were literally kids when Gordy found them. They came in, they did a couple of acts. Diana Ross at the top, Florence Ballard, who had a fantastic voice, Mary Wilson and Barbara Martin. They're the first lineup of the Supremes. This is 1961. They are 17 years old when you're looking at them here. They were high school girls from the Brewster Project signed. They hung around the offices. Gordy later recalled their audition, which is an a cappella version of the Drifters' There Goes My Baby. It was only so-so, he said, but their great confidence and extreme self-confidence won them over. They had this bubbly personality, especially Diana. So he signed them not as the Supremes, but as the Premettes. Then Gordy decided they needed a better name and came up with the Supremes. They were the sweethearts of Motown. Everybody loved them. Barbara Martin left in 1961 when she got pregnant. None of them ever thought of hiring an agent or a legal counsel, said Mary Wilson. They just belonged to Motown. A fellow started hanging out at the back. This is 1961. He was 22 years old. Secretly behind Gordy's back, he was dating Gordy's sister, Anna, who he later ends up marrying. You might recognize here somebody who later goes on to do the songs, Marvin Gaye, at the age of 22, signed to Motown very early on. Entrance in a rural Michigan high school talent show in 1961, there at the Plain, the Marvelettes. Within months, they delivered Motown its first #1 single, Please Mr. Postman. Many of you may recall that, 1961. On the right, that group of those five great gents, that's Otis Williams and The Distance. They might not have ended up at Motown if it hadn't been for Otis having a torrid affair with Mary Wells, who brought them to Gordy and signed them and then changed their name to The Temptations. We're always going to make quality records. Gordy here playing the piano for a group that includes Smokey Robinson. You'll see him here at the back, and Stevie Wonder, the second from right. This is the talent that's just hanging around this little house that's called Hitsville. And in 1962, Gordy decides to send them on what he calls a motor review, 45 of them on the road. And putting on such a review like that was a really daunting task, a Herculean task for a small company like Motown. All of it was done in-house, from the artists, the producers, the background singers, the musicians, the managers. For Gordy, he wanted the tour to promote the company, sort of boost the established artists, provide exposure for the unknown acts, and raise some cash, which was important for him. And he planned to use touring to build the artist roster, and it became an industry norm by the late 1960s. Just like in other matters, he was a little bit ahead of his time. The chaperones tried to do their best when they went on the road with this, but it was tough. The Marvelettes were all 18, as was Mary Wilson and Diana Ross. Flo Ballard was 19. The oldest girls were Martha Reeves and the Vandellas at 20 and 21. This is when they are dressed up, they're ready to go, and they're on the performance for that 1962 show. And as you could imagine, one of the things that happens in Motown, not only do you have these great artists, but they work together, they're playing together, they go on the road together, and as a result, they have affairs together. So Smokey became the first to marry another artist, Claudette. All of Gordy's sisters married within the business. Gwen married Harvey Fuqua, Anna married Marvin Gaye, and Luce married saxophonist Ron Wakefield. Gordy's niece Iris married producer Johnny Bristol. Eventually, Mary Wells married Ray Barr's singer Herman Griffin. The Marvelettes, Wanda Young, married the Miracles' Bobby Rogers. Georgiana Dobbins, also the Marvelettes, married the Contours' Billy Gordon. And A&R director Mickey Stevenson married singer Kim Weston. And more than marriages, affairs flourished. You needed a scorecard to keep track of them. The Supremes, Mary Wilson with Eddie Kendricks, and later with Duke Thacker of the Four Tops. 16-year-old Gladys Horton of the Marvelettes paired off with Hubert Johnson of the Contours, and Otis Williams of the Temps went with Supreme's Flo Ballard. Diana Ross had affairs besides her long one with Berry Gordy, with Smokey Robinson, Eddie Kendricks, and Brian Holland. Sometimes it seemed as if the company was just one big bed, said Tony Turner, who was a roadie for some of the Motown acts like the Temptations. And that caused part of the problems, because when those marriages or affairs broke up, there were bad feelings. And so Motown was a place that was happy when things were going well, and then was unhappy when things started to break up. In December of '62, they appear at the Apollo in New York City, which is their big location. The Miracles, the Marvelettes, Stevie Wonder. This is the moment that Gordy and Motown had been waiting for. Here's Marvin Gaye with Martha and the Vandellas in that theater in December of '62, one of those great moments. And of course, what does Gordy do? He takes the recording, and he turns it into an album, and he releases it. Gordy always knew how to make money from everything that happened. Famous for Motown hits like My Girl and Get Ready, the Temptations sort of, they spun across that stage in a synchronized manner. They glided through their polished choreography, and here they are at the Apollo Theater in 1964. Now, you look at them in black and white, yeah, they look fantastic, but you have to remember them in color to really see what they were about, because it's color that brings Motown alive in many ways. The outfits that we didn't see all the time. And in 1965, Gordy decides it's time to send his Motown stars, Supremes, Smokey, Martha, and Vandellas, over to the UK. And they head over to the UK for what becomes a big hit. These are some of the early signs as they appear around in London. They appear with Georgie Fame. And here are some photos of the 3 recording vocal groups involved in this '65 Motown review. They're at the London landmark Marble Arch. This is shortly after they arrived. At the top row is the Miracles, the middle row is the Temptations, and the bottom row is the Supremes and the Vandellas. My wife is born and raised in Britain, a native Brit, so she knows that those umbrellas are wise to have in London on almost any day. And here the artists are on March 19th, 1965, at the launch of the UK label at Elm House in London. And here is Martha and the Vandellas with Dusty Springfield. For those of you who remember the great Dusty Springfield on a Motown special taped in March of 1965. This is a period in which the Supremes come into their own. They are appearing now on Ed Sullivan. And for the first time, Gordy is getting a string of hits that are coming through. But he doesn't stop, because he has his stars, but he's also on the road for new ones. In 1968, Bobby Taylor of Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers discovers a group of 5 talented kids from Gary, Indiana, and brings them over to Gordy for an audition. The audition so impressed Gordy, he signed them as the Jackson 5 that day. And the Jacksons had driven from Gary, Indiana in their VW bus. Gordy was barely seated when the group broke into the Temptations' Ain't Too Proud to Beg. And Gordy thought, these kids have talent. And they did. They went on again. They went on to Ed Sullivan. They were on American Bandstand. They started to perform, and the Jackson 5 were at the top of the charts within 2 years of being signed. They were dominating the Motown labels. For Gordy himself, he was enjoying a bit of the good life. He had built a mansion in Detroit that was unseen many times, indoors. It was quite grand. He had a picture painted of himself when you came into the house that sort of looked like a pensive Napoleon Bonaparte, but it was Berry Gordy, and he was leading his empire, which was in fact, without any doubt, the Motown label. Now, one of the things that happens is in 1971, Marvin Gaye ends up releasing the album, and he wanted to do a protest album. And Gordy never allowed politics at the company. He said, you've got to keep politics out. I don't want to have it involved. And he was criticized often by leaders of the American Civil Rights Movement for not being more involved with Martin Luther King and others. He released some speech albums of Martin Luther King, but he never really went forward, never was involved in the Civil Rights Movement. He never made contracts that were necessarily better than what these artists could have had at white-owned companies. He said, I'm a black entrepreneur, and I'm a successful one. I'm interested in being a successful entrepreneur. So he kept politics out. Marvin Gaye went to him and said, I want to do an album, and I want to do a protest album. Gordy's response was to him, protest about what? Gaye gave him a smorgasbord of gripes: Vietnam, police brutality, social conditions, a lot of stuff. Gordy told Gaye, you're taking things too far. But Marvin Gaye was nothing if not stubborn, and he wasn't dissuaded. I'm not happy with the world, he told Gordy. I'm angry. I have to sing about it. I have to protest. So Gordy said, okay, if you're going to do it, but stick to what works. And at least make it commercial. And I think that Marvin Gaye did make it commercial in What's Going On. It's an amazing album. And to the extent that you hear any political overtones in that, it broke the rules for Gordy. And then Gaye went on to drive Gordy crazy, because although Gordy was apolitical, Marvin Gaye got involved one after the other in different issues. Here he is with U.S. Ambassador to Ghana, Shirley Temple at the time, and the UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim to discuss an African literacy campaign. This is also about the time in the early 70s when the rumors start to go around in music magazines and the newspapers that the Mafia had controlled Motown, that's how Berry Gordy had made Motown so successful. The rumors were that that Gordy himself was in debt to loan sharks. He had a heavy gambling, was an inveterate gambler, and that the loan sharks had bailed him out and owned shares in Motown. A trip to the Caribbean, it was said Gordy was kidnapped and had to sign over some of the ownership. Barney Ailes was of Sicilian ancestry, so that fueled the rumors. Mike Roshkin, who you see in the middle right here next to Stevie Wonder as a top PR executive, there were rumors that he was connected to the Jewish Mafia. I looked into those extensively, and let me tell you, in the end, the Mafia is an equal opportunity, it will take money from anybody they can, but the Mafia did not make Motown. It was made with the talent of Berry Gordy and those singers. I do have a chapter called Suitcases of Cash. I wrote about a complex scheme that Mike Lushka, who's the fellow in the middle bending over with the name tag on him, later testified about, a complex scheme for hiding royalties from the artists and songwriters. They did a thing called cutouts. Returns of albums, of physical albums, were charged back to the artist's account, so it came off their royalties. And starting in the early 70s, Lushka said he went out and picked up from distributors suitcases, literally, of cash, and he would bring them back to Motown. They would falsify the invoices so the artist got paid less. There's no evidence that Gordy got any of that money. Nobody was ever charged over it. The people who came out on the short end were the artists to the extent that it existed, but it wasn't the Mafia running Gordy. And Gordy wasn't paying attention as much to the music business at this point because he had moved to LA in 1974. Motown was taken over in 1972. Holland, Dozier, and Holland, the songwriters, left after a bitter lawsuit. Gordy had moved to LA. Mary Wells had left for GM after they had offered $500,000. The Four Tops had refused to go with him. Gladys Horton, the lead singer of the Marvelettes, decided to stay in Detroit and raise her family. The Funk Brothers, the back band, didn't move with him. The new president of Motown was Ewart Abner. He was the president from 1973. He was militantly Afrocentric, and many of the white executives who worked there said he was an unrepentant racist. Some of them left, and Motown started to falter in terms of its music sales. There's Abner together with, at that point, with Jesse Jackson. In LA, meanwhile, the reason for the move to LA was Diana Ross. It's Diana Ross who wanted to break into the movie business. And you see the small child she has there. She's sitting at a picnic. Nobody knew that that young daughter, that infant daughter, Rhonda, was Berry Gordy's daughter. They had had that child, and really, it was probably the only person that Gordy truly loved was Diana Ross. She wanted to break into movies. She went to LA. Gordy followed her. Michael Jackson trusted one person in all of Motown, and that was Diana Ross. And Gordy actually hits it big. In 72 and 73, he becomes fascinated with Hollywood. He decides to cast Ross into the lead role of Billie Holiday in Lady Sings the Blues, and she gave a heroic performance. Won rave reviews, a Golden Globe, she got an Oscar nomination, and it looked like Berry Gordy was going to pull off in Hollywood what he had done in Motown, make a successful career. But as Diana Ross became famous in Hollywood, she became less liked by old Motown music fans. And that was because, in part, although Flo Ballard, one of the original members of the Supremes, had hit hard times, she had a great voice. She ended up penniless, and when she eventually died, Diana Ross went back to Detroit in 1976 to her funeral. She was literally hissed and booed at the time by fans of Motown that had gathered outside. She was visibly nervous. She seemed on the verge of tears and stumbled at one point. Her bodyguards almost had to carry her by the arms to her pew. So you could see sort of how her fans back in Detroit didn't share the wonders of her success in Los Angeles. And then Gordy stumbled. In 1975, he made a film called Mahogany. It was mediocre, follow-up to Lady Sings the Blues. And then the big flop was in 1978, The Wiz. It was a commercial failure. $24 million production, earned only $13 million at the box office. And in pre-release, it lost another $10 million through CBS. It really was the end of Diana Ross's film career and the end of Gordy doing anything in Hollywood. In 1983, Motown had a reunion, Motown 25, but it was a reminder of what might have been. Among its highlights were Michael Jackson performing Billie Jean and doing the moonwalk, but the Jackson Five hadn't been together for years and he wasn't assigned to Motown any longer. Diana Ross came back to do Someday We May Be Together, and in one scene she pushes, Mary Wells away from the microphone. The Marvelettes weren't there. David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks were not invited. Martha Reeves and Mary Wells' songs were cut just to a verse. It wasn't a very happy reunion. The next year was the low point for Motown. Unfortunately, Marvin Gaye, killed by his own father, sort of had hit the low point in a drug addiction, and his father, where he was living at home, takes Marvin's life. And it's really sort of the rise and fall of these tremendous stars. In the early 80s, all Motown has left is Lionel Richie is still there, and Rick James, who is a person who's really doing X-rated lyrics, that are pre-rap, hip-hop lyrics, and that's what Motown is selling. By the late 80s, Motown was a shadow of its former glory. When Diana Ross joined, Lamont Dozier and Eddie Holland and Brian Holland inducted to the Rock Hall of Fame, none of them were still with the label. Gordy sold Motown to a group of private investors for $61 million in 1988, and he walked away with it. He later sold all of his music rights to EMI for $132 million the first half, and then another $110 million for the second half. It had nothing to do with it by the end of 2004. So in wrapping up, I don't know if you can hear this.
We own the country today with the song that brought them to the top of the record field. They're good-looking youngsters with long hair, and on them it looks good because they're girls. The Supremes.